Within days of being recognized as the winner of the 2024 presidential contest, the 47th President of the United States of America, Donald Trump, began releasing the names of his top political advisors and cabinet officers. The initial response was rather muted. Susan Summerall Wiles' appointment as the first female chief of staff was well regarded. And then things got a little weird. It was no surprise that former UN Ambassador Nikki Haley would not have a role, but was so publicly rebuked, along with former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, a Trump loyalist in the eyes of many who would not have a role in this Trump administration. And the initial release of names, Senator Marco Rubio for Secretary of State, Congressman Michael Walz as National Security Advisor, John Ratcliffe at CIA, all fit the mold of serious individuals for serious jobs. And as I said, things got a little weird. Fox Media anchor Pete Hegseth for Secretary of Defense, Kristi Noem, Secretary of Homeland Security, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. for Head of Health and Human Services were all head scratchers, but somewhat justifiable. But the one that turned the nomination process, and I hate using this phrase, into a clown show was the nomination of Congressman Matt Gaetz as Attorney General. Political commentator Eric Erickson described the Gaetz nomination as a brilliant political move by President Trump. It removes Gaetz from Congress, where he was despised by both parties. It saved Gaetz from having the House investigation made public. And since it's doubtful that Gaetz can be confirmed by the Senate, it eliminates Gaetz as a political problem for the president in Florida in the future. Does all of that make sense?
Well, it is also a kind of a distraction strategy on the part of Trump. I mean, I'm fascinated to watch the poly markets, the futures market, which does predictions as the chances that Gaetz will be actually confirmed, and it seems to drop hour by hour. I don't think there's any chance that he will be confirmed, but of course it does distract the conversation from some of the other nominations that, as you've mentioned, it could well have generated a lot more controversy. So think of Gaetz as being something of a lightning rod.
Well, Mike, every administration, let's face it, every administration has some clunkers that get proposed that have trouble getting through the nomination process and don't get nominated and don't get approved and appointed to the office. But given the outrageousness of some of these nominations, I have to expect Larry Hogan will be nominated for a position, or is that just a pipe dream?
I think that's probably more of a pipe dream. I know that Mark has some thoughts otherwise, and I would struggle to see how, given the statements that former Governor Hogan has made, that he would either, one, want to accept such a position, or two, be offered such a position if one were to be presented to him. But I'd be curious to see. And at this point, I'm just sitting back and watching and see where things go and how the pieces fall apart or fall together. And this is what people wanted, and so I think it'll be interesting to see what it presents.
Well, I pose that question with tongue in cheek because I think it's well known that it won't happen. But one of the interesting things that came out of this election was that, and the Baltimore Sun released this report, I believe, yesterday, was that the percentage of vote that President Trump received from Marylanders increased by 2.5% during this last election in 2024, as opposed to 2020. Is there any indication that Maryland is turning more right? Mark, I'll ask you.
Well, I think I looked at those numbers, and I think some of it was also on turnout among Democratic voters, which was not as strong as it was 4 years ago. So I think there's that component, because obviously we also saw a number of specific demographics in which Trump did better. And I will go back, because I did want to correct you. There is a position for Larry Hogan in the administration, and actually ambassador to South Korea. So let me just go on record making that prediction. Happy to expand on that, but I'll just include it.
I think that becomes obvious because Mrs. Hogan is Korean and Korean descent, and that would be and there was a close relationship between South Korea and Maryland during the COVID,
Right.
where we were reliant on supplies from Korea, and that relationship provided beneficial. So that would be an interesting appointment if that came through. I was also wondering about some of the other election races here in Maryland, Mike. We saw in the 6th district that April McLean Delaney was ultimately decided to have won that nomination. What do you think of her as our future congressperson?
I think she's got her work cut out for her. I think that she carried that district. I think to your point, I think Neil has shown that he can be a strong candidate there. I think he ran another strong race. I don't think she ran as strong a race as she probably as people were expecting. And I think that she got through. And so I think the challenge now is for her to really kind of, buckle down and really what are the issues that she wants to focus on and what does she want to bring to the 6th district? And I think that'll be curious to see how that unfolds in the coming weeks and months in light of how Congress is going to set itself up.
Mark, have you seen any of the election results from that race as to whether or not independents played a major role in that election?
Well, as you said, this has been a tightly contested race over the last since the lines were drawn. I was very surprised that this was not more broadly identified as being one of those toss-up rates. It had been identified, I think, in a lot of sites as being sort of leans Democrat, and I don't think it reflected just how close that race was going to be. As we've talked about before, it's one half of the district is overwhelmingly Republican, and the other half is Democrat, and it's a very few independents in the middle that ends up deciding that race. So those numbers, I think, suggest that for the balance of the decade, it will continue to be a very competitive race. Certainly, people are going to look at those numbers for 2026, and I think continue to focus on it as being one of those swing districts that decides who's speaker.
So did Neil Parrott have enough support from the Republican Congressional Committee? Did he get enough money? Was that the problem?
I don't think that there was enough support. I don't think there was a broad enough recognition as to how competitive that race would be.
And I think that went both ways. I'm not sure that April McLean Delaney got as much support as people anticipated she would be getting from the party either. So I think to your point, Mark, it's right. I was surprised that wasn't seen as highlighted more on the national scale, and it really wasn't, because I thought it was going to be a close race.
Mike, I'll take a contrarian view here. I mean,
really?
When you have a multi-millionaire, it's what a shock, right? When you have a multimillionaire running for her first time for office, and her husband another multimillionaire had been elected, people think they can self-fund. Why should they give them their money? And isn't that the problem with her candidacy?
Well, I think that was certainly a piece. I think that was a challenge, especially when you look at Congressman Trone and the amount of money that he spent. So I think whether you like it or not, and I wouldn't know because I don't have those types of resources, but I think once you pass a certain threshold, you're kind of thrown into the same camp, and I don't know if that's fair or not.
Well,
I think you raise a really
tonight is $370 million, Mike. Go buy a ticket.
So you raise an important point about District 6, which is how potentially expensive it is as a race. I mean, we think about it as being in the Washington TV market. It's also in the Pittsburgh television market.
Right.
So you could be spending a lot of money to contest this.
Yeah, but don't you have to carve out those votes from Montgomery County if the Republican Party expects to win?
Absolutely, yes.
And that's where your costs are, right?
Yeah.
You can't do it all by internet ads, right?
Right.
I wouldn't think.